Hi there, Herle Burlyites. Pre-pandemic, we used to read the words, "Hey, can we touch base?" or "Let's connect," basically as rote at the end of an email or a note. Now, in our various forms of isolation, many of us separated from our parents, finding ways to connect has taken on a whole different level of importance. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is doing what they can to help by delivering over 10,000 free mobile devices to help isolated seniors, hospitalized patients, and vulnerable Canadians stay connected during the COVID-19 pandemic. TELUS Mobility for Good COVID-19 emergency response is providing those free mobile devices and $0 rate plans valued at more than $5 million to hundreds of organizations across the country. More than 6,000 devices have already been donated. According to Julie Charette, President and CEO of La Fondation de Chum in Montreal, these measures will allow several psychiatric patients to remain hopeful and stay connected with their loved ones, and also to limit the risk of transmission of the virus among healthcare staff. Karen McDonald, Executive Director of SAGE Seniors Association in Edmonton, puts it like this: the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the risk this creates for seniors who need a phone to access emergency and health services, delivery of food and medication, and to stay connected with family and friends. We are especially grateful to TELUS for responding so quickly and generously to this critical need. As we all adapt to our new normal, it's more important than ever to hashtag stay strong, stay connected. Visit TELUS.com/COVID-19 to learn more. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Herle Burly. It's another week. We've got a packed show for you today. I'm going to unveil our 12-point plan for safely reopening the Herle Burly. The first point of which is the gradual cessation of me podcasting in my Spider-Man pajama bottoms and easing back into hard pants. Hard pants, by the way, is my favorite contradictory term to come out of the work from home era. We've got another two-part podcast today, Herle Burlyites, to satisfy all your political, pandemical, podcastical listening needs. First up, our special guest, Michael Bryant, a noted lawyer, teacher, academic, then an MPP in Ontario, as well as the province's youngest ever Attorney General. Michael is now Executive Director and General Counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. We're going to talk today about government restrictions imposed during COVID. What is the tension between flattening the curve and flattening our freedom? What are we prepared to give up or not give up? And what restrictions might remain when this whole thing is over? After Michael, the political panel weighs in on all of that, plus Doug Ford, the long-term care issue and reopening the economy, the federal conservative leadership situation, and some more questions from our reader mailbag. So stay tuned for the panel. But Michael Bryant, let's get going. Thank you for joining us, first of all. Thanks for taking the time to be on.
My pleasure, David. It's great to be here.
How are you?
Good.
I mean, it's been 6 or 7 weeks now that we've all been trapped in our houses and going through this circumstance. How are you personally holding up, Michael?
Great. Our organization has never been more busy. We've never had so many white middle-class people being carded, and as a result, CCLA has got a lot to do, and so it's one of those moments where I feel very privileged to work in the field.
Personally, how are you holding up through all this?
Good. You know, I'm enjoying it. The chaos. I think I just work well in a crisis, and for me, it's the downtimes that are tougher. And my kids keep me pretty humble.
Are you actually homeschooling? I read today in the paper that this is all falling apart, that kids are losing interest and parents can't do it, and the whole homeschooling thing is not a triumph right now.
Yeah.
Are you teaching?
No. I'm, my kids are 16 and 18, and so they are, they are at this point self-taught, and especially since they're in French immersion. And my French is okay, okay, but theirs is way better. So as a result, it's there isn't really much for me to do at all except occasionally proofread something. So they're taking care of me, not the other way around.
Excellent. Let's start off at the basics. What is the CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association? What is it?
In the 1960s, a bunch of lawyers got together. They were not happy with an Ontario government police act, and they, inspired by the American Civil Liberties Union, started the CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Julian Porter and Sid Linden were the first general counsels. They were part-time. Then eventually, around 1967, there was a bequest and they were able to pay someone full-time. Alan Borovoy got it. Alan Borovoy ran the Canadian Civil Liberties Association for really his entire adult life until just over 10 years ago. And during that time, this membership-based organization would go to court and, as an intervener or as an applicant or a plaintiff, challenge federal and provincial laws across the country where they were before the charter, where they were inconsistent with civil liberties. So they were before the Supreme Court of Canada for the first Morgentaler case before the Charter of Rights. They opposed the use of the War Measures Act in 1970. And then after the Charter of Rights, they were really the premier legal intervener before that court and had a real impact in shaping some of our laws in Canada and our civil liberties, often taking quite unpopular positions, defending free speech, for example, and intervening on the side of Ernst Zundel and other cases where, as you see with the American Civil Liberties Union as well, where the majority wants somebody silenced or arrested or in some way restricted, and a minority deserves to have their freedom protected so that all of our freedoms can be protected. It's a small operation still, really. There's only 9 of us all in, and we're obviously busy these days, focusing on equality, privacy, fundamental freedoms, so freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and the policing powers. And those are the general areas that we tend to cover in the way that we divide up the programs.
Interesting. Just as a sidebar, why is it an association instead of a union? Why is the American one a union and you're an association?
Right. I can only guess that it's because of its original inception. It was an unincorporated association in Canada, although the main leader that we had, Alan Borovoy, came from the Canadian Labour Congress, and we were very much part of the labor movement, the CCLA, and hopefully still remain that way. Whereas I think at the time that the lawyers founded it, it was less about labor unions and more about police powers. I'm sure the ACLU, on the other hand, was more about labor rights, although it may have just been a legal quirk that in order to create such a beast in the United States, you needed to be a union, whereas in Canada, it could be an association. But if we were the CCLU, it would have worked out a lot better from my perspective, because that's better branding than the gigantic mouthful of Canadian Civil Liberties Association. My goal is to get the brand to the point where you say CCLA, people know what you're talking about. And
right.
In the United Kingdom, they had a similar name for it, and they finally rebranded a few years ago, and they're just called Liberty now. And the newspaper reporters are glad for it because that's a lot less ink.
I can imagine. So what I really wanted to talk with you about today, and this is why you are ideally placed to do this, both in the current job that you have and the fact that you were a former Minister of Justice in government, I think gives you a really unique perspective on this. So provinces are now, and it's been left up to the provinces, and that may be something that you want to comment on. There isn't going to be a national reopening plan. Provinces are allowed to put their own together. And so as they do that, there are going to be tactics used to try to constrain the spread of the virus while we are starting to somewhat associate with each other again and work outside the home, etc. How does one, there's an obvious conflict here between the kinds of things government might do to keep track of us, to monitor us, to protect others from us. There's an obvious conflict there between our civil rights and civil liberties and the desire to open the economy, the desire to open society. How do you weigh those competing demands? And are there any principles, Michael, that we should be trying to apply to the situation?
The principles that I'd say that the principles would work like this, that we have a presumption of freedom in this country, and we're free to go and free to do what we wish to do. We have this free will, and the only way that we can restrict it is if you meet three criteria. One, it needs to be prescribed by law. So our parliament or our legislative assembly, or I guess the municipal city council needs to put in writing and pass and debate, and hopefully debate and pass in that order, a law that puts that restriction on freedom in place. And then which of these is going to be constitutional? It needs to be necessary. It needs to pass the necessity test. Why are we doing this? And why is it, I'd say, urgent that we be restricting people's freedom? And then the third test is proportionality. Is this necessary limitation on our freedom proportionate and restricting people's freedom as little as possible? Is there another way to do it, in other words? Or is it absolutely necessary that the freedom be restricted, at least for this period of time under these circumstances? And in those circumstances, then yes, it can take place. And those three tests match the constitutional legal test, but it's a decent way, I think, of thinking through the issue. Is it prescribed by law? So in other words, is it democratically validated? Is it absolutely necessary? And is it proportionate?
So those sound like charter tests to me, Charter of Rights tests to me. Does that mean that the charter will protect me and I don't need to worry about this at all?
The charter should protect you, unless a government uses Section 33 of the Charter of Rights to override, Section 33 of the Constitution. The Constitution Act 1982, unless they use the override clause when they pass the law, then the charter should be operating. The reality is that in these circumstances, judges are not artificial intelligence. They are living in this as well. The reality is that judges are going to be loath to interfere with governments at this time. And it would have to be a clear case, and you'd have to get the right judge. And, you'd need to also have courts open in that jurisdiction that you were bringing it. And the administration of justice would need to be set up in a way that it could handle this. That's one of the areas in Canada where emergency management preparation was not what it might have been, although we've been making it up as we go along.
So Section 1 of the Charter provides a big exception to the entire Charter, which is that you can, all the rights in the Charter are subject to such reasonable limitations as might be demonstrably justifiable, or as can be demonstrably justifiable, in a free and democratic society. Do you think that governments and courts will have a different view of what that means in the middle of this pandemic than they do in normal circumstances? What is demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society?
Right. Well, the legal test for that ends up boiling down to what I just described. Is it prescribed by law? Is it necessary? And is it proportionate? And where this gets fuzzy and where governments overreach is when there isn't specificity between the means and the ends. So there's a pandemic, yes. Is doing something about the pandemic compelling objective, so protecting people's lives? Yes, it is. It is. But there is a big question which we have skipped over. But I'm not sure it's the end of the world that we've skipped over. But we have skipped over it. If you look,
put it on the table.
Sure, it is the precisely what the necessity is and its proportionality. And it's speculative in the sense that, in the midst of the pandemic, when all is said and done, does it make sense that so many people had their liberty restricted? Just forget for a moment about the economic impact. Does it make sense that so many millions and millions of people had their liberty so restricted on a mass scale, the likes of which Canada has never, ever seen? We've never, ever had mass restrictions on liberty like this before in this fashion, as severe as they are, where basically it really does feel when you're outside as if you're doing something wrong for being outside. So there is a presumption of guilt for those in the outdoors, at least in an urban setting. When I step out of my condo onto a sidewalk, I'm very mindful of the fact that I am a few steps away from getting charged by the police or a bylaw officer. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels that way. Does it make sense that all of this massive restriction on people's civil liberties was done under the circumstances? Exactly what was the risk here? And I think it boils down to whether or not we ought to have all restricted our freedoms for what amount to actually a tiny proportion of our population, and primarily an aged and vulnerable population. And the answer has to be yes to that. But that's why we're all doing this. We are, when I say we, you're a very young man, David, but I'm, just over the hump of 50 years old. So I guess I'm in the danger zone-ish. But for everybody younger than me, they are restricting their liberties so that a geezer like me can be safer. And so that's the proportionality of all this. I mean, it's just, from my perspective, such an extraordinary national moment. And I realize the pandemic is so urgent and so extraordinary, but I don't know if we're going to look back and say that we all overdid it. I think we will. But it was to save a fraction of 1% of the population from dying. And that's enough. I mean, that's enough for people to restrict their freedom. But that's what this is all about.
Well, and that's been done with tremendous support by the population, which, by the way, doesn't, of course, mean anything when it comes to civil rights and civil liberties. People will often give up things that they shouldn't necessarily, without realizing the importance of it. But it was one thing when we were having ourselves constrained, our liberty constrained to protect the virus, to protect us from the health concerns of the virus. As we move into the economic opening phase, everything that I read, Michael, talks about some combination of mass testing and surveillance. of us as we're moving around. So around the world, governments are using everybody's cell phones or smartphones to GPS track them, monitor their behavior. Some are using geothermal to measure heat. Some are using facial recognition software, and it is incredibly intrusive. What is being done, and yet seemingly that is the only route that people are proposing that would allow us to reopen our economy. That seems to me like a different discussion than what do we need to do to stop this thing from killing all of us, is what are we prepared to do to get the economy moving. And it seems to me like all the pressures to open, and I get that, but people seem prepared to contemplate some pretty draconian measures in order to do that. Sorry for the long preamble. Go.
I mean, the way you're framing it, it's very. I like the way you framed it, and I think you're really putting your finger on the issue, which is, it's one thing for the compelling objective, which would justify a limit on our rights. It's one thing for the compelling objective to be to save people's lives, or to save us from a risk of respiratory illness. It's another if the objective is primarily economic. It's a different objective. It's not to say that it's an illegitimate objective, but it's different. It's not as compelling. It's not like I'm restricting my liberty to save my life. It's I'm restricting my liberty to advance a national economy. And the point that you're zeroing in on is that a compelling enough objective to restrict our liberties? And it'll depend on the framing. My bet would be that if the Attorney General was in front of the court on such a case, they would make it about the pandemic. They would they would seek to characterize it as about saving people's lives, when in fact the objective is not that. It's in fact an economic one. So let's talk about the technology and data and what may be coming. I think there's a couple of very different categories. For me, there's two huge categories of the employment of data and technology. One is private sector, so Apple, Google, or an app being used with somebody's consent. That's we all choose or not to have phones and mobile devices, and we can turn our location tracking on, or we can turn it off, that's in a whole other category of issues around storage and notice, and whether or not we're really consenting to things. Do we really have a choice? I really need to use this app, or the only way I can use it is to comply. That's a whole other issue. But my point is, from a constitutional perspective, the state's not involved in that. Maybe the state should be doing what the European Union did, which is to regulate the use of that technology and protect people's privacy. And CCLA is often doing that, and CCLA is in the courts against Waterfront Toronto and the city and the province and the federal government on the Quayside project along those very lines. But nevertheless, in that case, that's an instance where the state's involvement is really by omission. The second category of matters is where the state is involved and they are either authorizing or employing a technology as part of their in their toolkit, or, and then this is the one that requires more strict scrutiny, the state itself is passing a law or an order, and so usually this would be cabinet order, and council passes an order that would authorize data surveillance in some fashion. The mapping, as you described, the geothermal mapping, and and it's off. In other words, it's authorizing the use of this invasive technology as if it were authorizing wiretapping across the country. And in those circumstances, we've written all the first ministers and their relevant privacy ministers. The Canadian Civil Liberties did on April 20th. And the letter and the details are up on our website, ccla.org. And we set out the blueprint or the roadmap for how this might be done and what the test would be. And it does basically come down to what I said previously around necessity and proportionality. But we dig a little deeper and argue that the state should be firewalling off public health data for public health purposes. That the police and bylaw officers shouldn't get their hands on that. They need to undertake an impact detriment analysis for the vulnerable to see how this might affect the homeless. And the chief medical officer has to issue what we're calling a data warrant. So they have to specify, we need this data and we don't have this data. There's a data gap, but we need it. And here's why we need it. And, if the chief public health officer is swearing off on the data warrant, that's one thing, because that is about health and that is about the pandemic. But if it's, the economic development minister or the finance minister, our position would be that wouldn't justify data surveillance.
On a sidebar, Michael, what is your sense of whether ministers of justice and attorneys general are central to their government's decision-making right now or marginal to their government's decision-making right now? Yeah,
that's a really, really good question. I'd say the federal government, David Lametti and that ministry is central to their decision-making. Whereas I'm going to go up north to Nunavut, and their attorney general, I'd say, is not central to their decision making. And I base that on a public health order that they put out, which it's clear to me that the attorney general was not at the table when that was signed, because it's just got some very obvious constitutional problems with it. And province by province, it varies. And it is sometimes obvious and sometimes not. And it's obviously sometimes political for the really big decisions. But it is sometimes not. It's just about the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure within the province. So in Ontario, I know, because I had that job. Ministry of Attorney General lawyers are dispatched like annoying viruses into every ministry to give advice within their policy branches. You can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. Or if you do that, here's how you do it. And then the minister would come to see me and say, your lawyers are telling us that we can't do that. And I would think, oh, excellent. That worked. They're doing their job. And then I try and manage that. That setup where they're there working within each ministry varies from province to province. And, as you said, we have an asymmetrical federalism in operation right now where the cities and provinces are managing this pandemic less so than the federal government. And so it does make a big difference as to whether or not the attorney's agents have infiltrated the government or not.
So, assume everybody's not going to read the letter that the CCLA posted about surveillance and data.
Yeah.
And tell us if we're going to go down this road of mass testing of the population and of monitoring activity to make sure that we can identify who has been exposed and who hasn't been exposed. I mean, these things are all sold with the best of intentions, right? Mm-hmm. And the possibility of things like immunity passports, where you have a document that says I'm okay to come into this hockey game or I'm okay to come into my workplace, all that stuff. So if we're going to go down some version of that road, and if we're going to be okay with it, which some of the evidence is that we are going to be okay with it, what should we look out for? Like, at what point should we say, hey, that's too far? Don't do that. That's wrong. We don't need that. Or that is too intrusive for us to accept.
It's going to, firstly, time limits have to be put on everything. So in other words, the government's going to have to, just like they do with an emergency management order itself, they're going to have to go, they're going to have to pass an order and then pass an order again and then pass an order again every time.
But I'm still taking my shoes off at the airport.
Right. You're talking about, well, look, we don't, if the laws, this is the problem. If the law is in place, then you're just out of luck. You're out of luck because otherwise you're going to be, if you're not going to comply, you're going to be charged. So these are decisions that are going to require that people intervene and tell their MPs and MPPs and their councillors what's on and what's not on. So it's going to be in the crafting of the orders. It's going to be in what people are required to do or not required to do. It's not going to be in the application. In the application of it, people are just going to be stuck with the decisions that are made by their democratically elected officials. And that's that. There's, unless you want to engage in civil disobedience, find yourself with a massive fine and go to jail, in which case, CCLA will be there for you. People are going to have to comply, and they are complying. That's what's happening in Canada.
For sure, but what I was saying about the shoes is that these things don't tend to go away. So 25 years after 9/11, I'm still taking, 30 years after 9/11, I'm still taking, 20 years, I'm still taking off my shoes and at the airport. And so a lot of people are saying these infringements on our liberty, once they get put in place, they're not going to go anywhere. This is going to be a permanent feature. The government will be tracking me for the rest of my life.
Right. So, the answer to that has to be solved at the ballot box. I mean, I realize this is wholly unsatisfactory to people to be hearing this, but it's the only remedies are to be found in politics and in democracy and in judicial review. And along those lines, if the case for necessity isn't there, and it's not going to be there, the case for necessity is not going to be there in the sense of it being an urgent, in terms of its urgency. In the same way as the case for necessity is now long past post 9/11. So the courts are going to be, I think the courts in Canada are going to be an inadequate remedy for people on this front. And so it's going to be people telling their elected folks and making it a ballot issue that now freedom and liberty is a political issue in Canada in a way that it hadn't been before. And in fact, it's not about terrorism and it's not about a COVID pandemic. It's just about power. And in this in this case, it's about power and an industry. If we're going to talk about 9/11, it's a combination of the security industry coalescing and partnering with public safety ministries and solicitors general ministries, so as to put governments in a position that it's very difficult for them to say, no, we don't need this, or this is unnecessary, because then they have to be standing up to people in uniforms. And politically, it's a very, very hard thing to do and rarely done. But that's what it's going to take for this to happen, because it's going to be that same old battle where the ministry that tends to have a lot of power and use that power, which is public safety, and in this case, finance, is going to be pushing for the kind of restrictions on people's liberty that either they're going to stand up against or they're not.
One of the other things, Michael, is we know from the past that when governments have access to our data, they don't just use it for the purpose they told us that they wanted to access that data for. They use it for a whole bunch of other purposes. So how do we protect ourselves against that? So if the purpose of monitoring my activity and my movements is to make sure I don't have COVID, how do I end up not getting arrested for some other thing that they found while they were monitoring me for that?
Right. So, this is a key requirement that has to exist if the government, the government's going to be requiring us to do it, failing which we get fined, or failing which we say don't have access to transit or going out. Under those circumstances, that information, that health information, has to be treated like health information. So it's public health data, and public health data, just like your hospital records, cannot be accessed without a warrant. So unless the police go get a warrant to access that information, it should not be commingling with the public safety folks. And if that requirement isn't in there, in the orders in council that would authorize this data surveillance, then that would be unconstitutional. What can people do about it? Well, again, it's a political fix for people. They need to exercise their democratic rights as much as they can. But that's where the Canadian Civil Liberties Association has a job to do, to intervene and challenge the law. And we're doing that. We're doing that right now in the city of Toronto. We'll be doing it. We may be doing it in other areas as well.
Great. So how do people support you, Michael? If a person wants to support the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, what do they do?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. The CCLA.org, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association website, CCLA.org, on the homepage. You can't miss it when you get there. People can get our updates, which are weekly or more than weekly, by getting on our mailing list. They can become a member of the CCLA, which can be very, very cheap to super cheap, and take out a membership where they can donate to this registered charity, and all that's on the homepage.
Maybe I've missed it, but I haven't heard from Minister Lametti or Minister Mulrooney or other ministers of justice about the issues we've been talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think they should? Do you think they should talk to us a little bit about what we can expect?
Yeah, I completely agree, and so the law would require, ideally, that at least once a week at these briefings done by the First Minister, the Justice Ministers show up and say, okay, we've had this many people identified as infected with COVID, and this many people have tragically passed away, and we have laid this many charges and issued this many tickets, and this is what the offenses are for, and here is why we're doing it. Here's the justification. And they're available to answer questions about the particular issues impacting their community, which, up north includes a power of warrantless entry into people's homes. That's in Nunavut. Includes restrictions on any gathering of any kind, of any people. In province to province varies depending on the restrictions, and includes something that we were talking about before the show started, which is restrictions on people's constitutional right to mobility, to travel from province to province. Provincial borders were really relevant only for the purposes of taxation and commerce, but now they're patrolled as if they were checkpoint Charlies. And I had
no idea those were real borders that one could stop people from crossing.
Yeah. I mean, I know we know of in Ontario, at least, the eastern border and the western border only from the signs, right? You see a sign on one side, it says "Welcome to Ontario," and the other side it says "Thanks for coming." And bienvenue on the east, and so you're absolutely right. I didn't know that they existed either, but they do, because the police know where to line up in advance of the border to turn people back, and they are turning people back.
Thank you for doing this today, Michael. You're one of my oldest friends in politics, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of what is a really busy time for you to come on. And I also really appreciate what you're doing in life, because the reality is that none of us are vigilant enough about our very hard-won civil liberties. None of us are vigilant enough about them on an ongoing basis. And so to have watchdogs like you that are there and watching out on our behalf and safeguarding what we would easily give away is very reassuring. So thanks for what you're doing, and thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Let's have a drink. My pleasure. Hey, do I get to ask you a question?
Sure.
If you were advising the Prime Minister, I mean, given where we are right now, and given that we do have a bit of a patchwork, not a bit of a patchwork, we have a complete patchwork of rights, where your rights are very different in one province versus another. And I think that is the way to go. I do. But I'm a provincial guy. I grew up out west, and I was a provincial politician. You've been with both levels of government and both levels of politics. In hindsight, do you think that the federal government ought to have stepped in and provided a national regulation of this?
I don't, actually. It seems like the conditions are so different in each province. I think that if you're looking at it purely politically, there is a debatable proposition about whether the federal government would have wanted to look strong and in charge of this, as opposed to more of a facilitator of provincial actions. But I think, especially as we reopen, it makes sense for Saskatchewan to be starting to reopen. It doesn't make any sense for Ontario to be starting to reopen, it seems to me. And so I think that those kinds of decisions are the wisdom of our federation, better left to more local authorities. But the safeguarding of our rights throughout that whole process, I don't have any confidence in provincial governments to do that at all. And so I'm really looking for a strong role from the federal government to protect us through that process.
And so this raises the last thing, and we're now really going over time, but I've had conversations with people in the federal government about this very issue. What is the appropriate role of the federal government to safeguard? So in other words, maybe they don't intervene legally, but how do they advocate? Do they start playing the role of diplomats, where, Lametti and his ministry, or Nav Bains and his ministry, are reaching out to other provincial governments and saying, look, this is your business, and this is your jurisdiction, but here are some of the issues that you should be thinking about. Just from a federal, provincial, territorial minister's perspective, that's new. That kind of diplomacy is new.
Right. And just the last thing is, Section 1 provides governments all the latitude that they need. They do not need the notwithstanding clause, right?
That's right. Yeah, no. It's all everything. The most restrictive law that's out there right now is with respect to interprovincial mobility. I mean, it's clear you're supposed to have mobility rights. If I can't go from Ontario to Quebec, then I have no mobility right. That would probably be upheld on the basis that it was put in place for the purposes of the pandemic, and it's proportional all under Section 1. It would be saved under Section 1. And Section 1 is in operation across the country for dozens and dozens of orders in council and ministerial orders that are in place right now.
Great. Thanks for coming on, Michael. Stay safe and work hard for us, will you? Thank you.
It's a deal.
Great. Jenni, Scott, here we are. We're back. It's another week with the panel.
Yay.
How are you both? Say hi.
Hi.
Hi. All right. Now we got to have a word from one of our sponsors. If we have learned anything over these past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. The only way to really get the detailed boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west, but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Jenni Byrne.
Hey.
Jenni Byrne.
How are you?
Another week of isolation. How are you?
Well, I'm okay. I went home this weekend. I sat 6 feet away from my grandma in her driveway and got to visit with her. So that was nice. It was weird not being able to hug her. I think my entire life I've never not been able to hug my grandma. Right. And I got to watch Game 2 of the 1989 Stanley Cup Finals, which was 1989, which was the players I grew up loving, Scrudland and Courtnall and Waugh and Gainey and Robinson. They won that one, but the end of the series was not as. I was in grade 8, and I bet almost the entire school $2 each, including the principal. And the next day, when my mom forced me to go to school because I begged her not to make me go to school, after the morning announcements, Mr. King said, "Oh, and by the way, Jenni, I'll be in my office all day if you want to bring down the $2 to the entire school."
I was in the forum with my brother. I was in the forum for games 3 and 4 of that series. Game 3, if I'm recalling correctly, is one of the best hockey games I've ever seen. It was double overtime, and Ryan Walter scored the winning goal, I think, in the second overtime period. But what a hell of a hockey game that was. I think Game 4, however, which the Flames won, I think that was kind of the backbreaker of the series.
You guys are braver than I am. I can't revisit that series. They've had that series on, and they played about a week ago. They played the first game of the '93 championship run. 1993, Jenni, David and I watched every single game together of the entire run. And you remember it started with 2 consecutive losses, so it was a little bit rough, and then we ended it by getting into a bar fight and damn near got arrested. So we recall '93 with great glory, but I 89 broke.
Place called Herle's Sports Coliseum. Ironically,
there we go.
The bouncer ended up picking me up and putting me through the video machine. Video game machine.
The Habs win the cup, right? We're going crazy. Place going crazy. All this stuff. Bouncer walks over and switches the TV to the NBA, within a minute of the game being. And Herle is
awarded the cup.
No, David is like, "Hey, can you put it back?" The guy's like, "Go fuck yourself." David's like, "No, fuck you." He says, "No, fuck you." And then David gets up in the guy's face, and the bouncer pops David one. It was awesome. And then we got dragged down the back stairs. This guy was like, "David, you're not a small fella," and this guy was 3 times the size of David. He was built like a dirigible. It was unbelievable. I was kind of like, "David, hit him harder. Hit him. Jesus, David, hit him harder. I'll put my beer down and yell closer."
I wish I could say that is the only time I've been kicked out of a bar because of the Montreal Canadiens, but it is not true. My brother William and I were barred for years from the bar at the Fairmont the Fairmont Estates out in BC, Fairmont Resorts, because in a Quebec City Nordique Canadiens game in the 80s, we got kind of out of control. My mom had a timeshare there, and we were banned from the bar for years.
Is that the game where they fought before the puck was dropped?
Yeah.
Well, that would have provoked emotions.
So, let's talk politics. First of all, what did anybody think about Michael Bryant? Anybody have any reaction to something Michael said in that pre-interview? You were listening.
Yeah, well, I think this is. I think it's it's a very timely, interesting topic. It's and he talked. It's the it's the weighing between the health and civil liberties, and more as we see stories about bylaw officers, mostly in Ontario, ticketing people for seemingly following the rules. I think it's going to become more and more of a topic, and you're going to hear more and more from him and the Civil Liberties Association.
I like the point that he made.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, Scott. Yeah.
Well, I think the point that he makes about there has been a kind of a conscious and a willing and transparent suspension of some liberties or a curbing of some liberties. That's been kind of voluntary, and we've all signed on to it for purposes of health. But as we enter into the reopening phase, I think those boundaries are going to get tested, and you're going to have a different kind of consensus. That consensus is going to break down. And, I listen to him, and maybe I have too much trust in institutions, too much faith in institutions. I'm not worried about the legal remedies to those things. I think those things will get challenged. I think the Michaels out there do exist. I think that the boundaries will get tested in court and that stuff will be set. So I'm not worried really about full scale, Big Brother invasion using facial recognition and all that stuff. And that's going to happen in a way that pervades. I think that the courts will force a reconciliation of that. But I think aside from it's not the legal scrap that I think ought to be concerning. I think there's going to be political. I think it's going to be a cultural. I think there's going to be a cultural scrap. I think you're going to start to hear the hard right, the guys that like to tote their guns, and not even those guys, like just regular folk are going to start to say, I'm not comfortable with these boundaries, I'm not comfortable with these restrictions. I want to do more. I want to break out faster. And I think you're going to see those tensions blow up. And it's going to lead to some ugly political discussions and some ugly cultural discussions.
I don't disagree with that.
I'm woefully naive about how much of my data I've already lost and how much various organizations like Google and Apple know about me already. But I am disturbed, and I'm comfortable with the notion of the government monitoring all of my movements.
But how realistic a threat is that? I mean, ultimately, I think the legal system doesn't permit that. I think, as David said, you're going to have chief health officers and medical officers sign off on warrants that permit surveillance. I think there'll be a big debate about what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do on that.
But why would chief medical officers sign off on warrants about surveillance of people's liberties?
To determine whether or not there is a health rationale that's valid for it.
That is a ridiculous.
But it isn't going to be a health rationale. It's going to be an economic rationale. Well,
no, it will be a health rationale.
No, but it's back to no. Sorry. That is insanity to say that public health officials would sign off on monitoring citizens. If that ends up happening, and God forbid, I'm not a libertarian, but this actually, all of this talk scares the hell out of me. There is no way it's up to public health officials.
It's not going to be up to them, but they get to attest to whether or not there's a public health imperative. So as an example, it's not like you'll go to a judge and they'll say, okay, what are the considerations as to why this is a reasonable intrusion on people's rights? And we'll say, well, because we need to know that this population where we think there's a resurgence is actually minding. So then we say, okay, well, the public health officer says that we do see a discernible uptick in infections. It's concerning. We need to deal with it. And this is one instrument we might do. And the court will decide. The health officer won't decide. The health officer will attest to whether or not there's a health imperative there.
No, who would have to go to the courts is the government. Justin Trudeau, right. Doug Ford, Francois Legault. And frankly, this is the problem that I've seen. All of these governments, not all of them, the majority of these governments have taken all decision-making, whether it is completely public health or economic, and turned it completely over to public health officials.
What is the evidence of that?
Because that's ultimately what they're saying. Every decision is based on public health. Like, I can't take credit for this, but I saw a commentator in the US. At the end of the day, scientists split the atom for the Manhattan Project, but it was Truman that had to decide to drop the bombs. Scientists are supposed to be giving politicians advice, and politicians are supposed to be making the decisions. If you look at the announcements of most governments, especially the one yesterday by Doug and the Ontario government, it seems to be that public health officials are making every determination, including opening up the economy.
I think that government officials are accountable for those decisions. I think that governments take them, and they are. If we don't,
politicians are accountable for
like them. We'll go on TV, radio, we'll complain, we'll bitch and moan, people will protest eventually. All those things will happen. So they are accountable for those decisions. They have to be informed by medical officers because it's a medical crisis. It's a public health crisis. So you got to be guided by that information. I'm comfortable. I mean, I would have done a couple of things differently from a pure comm standpoint than what Ontario did. But it cuts both ways. You want to talk about an incursion into my rights? Hey, sorry, Premier Legault, my fucking kids are not going back to school next month. They're not.
Before we get on to that, I just want to leave this point because you're too dismissive, Scott, about this. I'm telling you that you are going to accede to the government's right to monitor your movements and activities because of COVID. And 5 years from now, you're going to have 20 unpaid parking tickets, and the cops are going to show up at the bistro when you're drinking and eating wings there because they know exactly where you are.
Well, God help us. I hope it's there in 5 years. But I don't understand I understand that's a concerning scenario. I don't understand what gives us any sense of certainty that is a plausible scenario, because we have the Michael Bryants, because I'm not going to accede to that. I'm going to say, I think that this incursion is unreasonable. I'm going to be alert to that. I'm going to object to it. But I'm also going to say, I do think it's reasonable when I see that there's a public health imperative, and I say, okay, on a temporary basis, on a sunsetting basis, I'll permit this level of incursion on my liberties in order to protect myself. And, Michael characterized it as, well, we're protecting seniors. I don't believe that. We're protecting ourselves also.
No, you're sounding really, really naive. If you think government agencies are going to have the ability to track these things everywhere we go, and they're going to sunset, and all of a sudden they're going to say, "All right, we're taking away this. We're going to shut down this database. We're going to destroy it, and we're never going to use it because there's always going to be an emergency." They're going to say, "Well, there could be another COVID. So until everyone gets the vaccine, we're going to have to monitor for that." I think you're being very, very naive. And as I said, I am not a libertarian. I actually have argued for street camps to monitor, for gangs. I have had debates with my libertarian and friends on this. This is just one step too far.
I know, I'm sorry, David. I just wanted one last word on this, I guess I'll throw out. I think you guys are highlighting, importantly, a scenario that is disturbing. But you're talking with certainty as though that is the most plausible and almost the inevitable scenario. I don't believe that for now. And I don't think it's naive of me to think that governments would have to fight and justify the extension of those kinds of tools as opposed to just having them by default. And I would be the first to object to them having them by default. I don't think I'm naive. I think you guys sound kind of fucking paranoid.
No, you're naive.
No. I mean, the evidence is throughout our history, Scott, is that most of these powers, when governments take them on, they never relinquish them.
But that's an abuse of power, and as long as we're alert to it.
You're being ahistorical. Maybe you're right, but you're being ahistorical, not us.
I don't know, man. There are boundaries. There are laws.
You what?
There are boundaries. There are laws. Like, the government has to live by its own laws, and they'll have to justify these things. And this debate
will be laws.
But these, what you're talking, yeah.
And there'll be laws that will be sunset, and there'll be laws that will have limitations to them, and they're laws that will be tested under the charter. And if they're unreasonable, then they'll be busted that way. Now, there may be a period where there's unforgivable trampling until the courts impose on it. But then you'll end up in this peculiar place where all the libertarians who hate the courts will find that the courts are their salvation. So I'll enjoy that discussion.
But David, but Scott, to your point on the charter, it is against the charter to prohibit movement between provinces, but yet it's happening now, and no one's stopping it.
But as we heard Michael say, I think that's. I mean, I think that's inconveniencing. I think it's crummy. But as we heard Michael say, it's probably a defensible use of. It's probably a defensible exception. It's in the current for purposes of public health, saying sorry, I can't. You can't do that.
But you're actually arguing against. Anyways.
I don't understand. Well, no, but
that you're not going to. You are not going to do diddly squat about an attempt to get back rights that have been succeeded with this. You are relying wholly on people like Michael Bryant and court challenge programs and somebody out there to fight for you, because you're just prepared to hand it all over on a silver platter.
God, you guys make me sound like a resigned concubine to the philandering state. No, I'm not.
Well, you're talking. You're a liberal who's talking about it's okay right now to not abide by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's what you're.
The Charter of Rights and Freedoms accounts for the possibility that there will be reasonable limitations in extraordinary circumstances. Everything is that, like we heard what Michael said, it's about proportionality. Is it inconvenient? Would it, in a normal circumstance, be unconstitutional for the government of Quebec to do that? Yeah. Is it right now? It's probably justifiable, provided it's in response to a public health crisis, and it's limited in its application in that, and limited in its duration.
But governments, these were passed. Governments should not have the right to decide what is justified or not, because once it happens once, you might agree because it's a public health crisis.
Not government, who? Like who? The fucking guy who lives under the bridge and cleans his gun all night? Like, I don't understand. Who? Government is the elected representative body.
Yes. I agree with you. And
so they make those
Francois Legault is going against the charter to not allow people to cross into Quebec. And you're saying that's all right for politicians to do, which is completely, yeah. I can't believe that I'm on this side as a conservative arguing in favor of the charter, and you, who I bet I could go back and Google and see public quotes on you slamming conservatives on stuff like Omar Khadr on the charter, arguing against. Like, this is absolutely insanity.
The charter includes provisions for reasonableness. So provisions of the charter can be overlooked or waived for reasonable purposes. And I think saying, look, there's a public health, a public safety imperative where we're not going to allow people in while we try to maintain and get a handle on this thing within our own boundaries. I think that's, it's not my favorite public policy, but I don't think it is unjustifiable. It becomes unjustifiable if they try to extend it permanently. Then it's unconstitutional, then it dies. And I'm sorry, David, I actually think you're wrong. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I am actually the guy. I will go on, because I have access to radio and TV, this podcast and stuff. I would raise my voice. I would write an op-ed. I would say this is fucked if I think that's what's going on. So
and the government would shrug and say, I don't give a fuck.
Well, no, because there would be 300 more people like me, and there will be lawyers challenging them. I mean, maybe I have too much faith in this. I think you guys have too little.
But that doesn't take away the fact that they still have access to where you go every day. Anyways, I don't think we're going to I think we're just going around in circles now, yeah. David. So we might as well. Yeah,
but this surveillance state, Scott, I'm going to fucking hold you to it. You keep your eye on it, because I'm telling you, this surveillance state that we have enabled all the times that we've pressed, I agree, on an app on our phone, we've enabled this surveillance state, and now it's going to be in full force. Okay. Still sticking with COVID, and I know that you have a thought on this, Jenni, but both governments held, both the Ontario government and the federal government held briefings yesterday. Why did they do that?
I don't know, because they didn't really, neither of them announced anything. And I think this goes back to what we've been saying for the last, 6 weeks that we've been doing the podcast remotely, or I've been saying, is I think what people are getting sick of is the hypocrisy. It's almost like governments are looking at this for rollout opportunities. And I think that we've come to a point that unless there's something to announce, there's no reason to do it. You had Trudeau come out and say, "Oh, there's a coordinated strategy and all provinces are working together." Well, that's obviously not the case. And I know that in terms of Trudeau playing a role, the reason the federal government isn't coordinating a role is I don't think they want to wear it. I don't think he shows any interest in getting involved in the weeds and anything. It's just shoveling out money mostly to the provinces. And frankly, Legault, followed by Higgs, basically told him to fuck off. Legault was basically like, stay out of Quebec. I will handle it. And by the way, what we need from you is more transfer payments. In terms of Doug's announcement, the Ontario government's announcement yesterday, it was literally an announcement about nothing. It talked about different phases where they will consider opening up different areas, but with no date attached to them. And I think that people, even people that I speak to that are like Scott, that are happy to sit in their homes for the next 6 months and let the government run roughshod over their freedoms. Basically,
that's not a wholly fair characterization, in my opinion. But
basically, we're like, okay, what we wanted was a date. Even if it was June 1st, even if it was June 15th for phase 1, we just needed a date. And I think coupled with the hypocrisy, coupled with not having a date, coupled with the government's announcement to extend the school year to at least to May 29th, and let's be honest, it's going to be June. I think people are getting frustrated. Like my stepsister is a senior executive at a pharmaceutical company. Her husband is a senior person at Bell. They're working from home. They have 11-year-old twins, and with the e-learning, you actually have to be there and participate with your kids. Like there has to be some supervision, and they are having a very tough time being able to work and then maintain that their kids can continue with learning. So I think yesterday, I saw even in my social network a real change in thing. Scott, I have to be honest with you. You were the only person I spoke to yesterday, conservative, liberal, non-affiliated, that actually was defending Doug's announcement.
Okay, well, let me take a crack here, because I'm not going to defend it to the hilt. I thought there were two mistakes in it, but there were communications mistakes in my view. One, they should have preconditioned that there would be no dates, and then it would be a structure, and then it would try to identify blocks and phases and the things that would happen. It's a protocol. And I think that he should have preconditioned. The government should have, leaked it. They should have indicated in advance that that's what it was, so that expectations were appropriately conditioned. Because I thought that people
after Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, et cetera, people were kind of expecting an opening up plan, right?
That's right. And so if they weren't going to go that way, I think they should have signaled in advance just to save themselves some grief. That's a comms management issue. I think the second thing, which perhaps a bit more substantive, is that when we came to what the tests were with respect to the cases, like how many cases will we need, I think they should have been more definitive with numbers there. Where I don't think there's any grounds to really hammer the government and forward is, they didn't give a date. How in Christ is he supposed to give a date? He doesn't know when those cases are going to drop. We don't know when the public health threat is going to diminish sufficiently that we can say that we'll start to implement it. I think it is somewhat reassuring as the weather gets nicer and people are more anxious about getting out of their homes to say it's going to kind of work like this. It won't be a snap of the fingers like Georgia, where, Christ only knows what's going to happen. They're going to try to open the whole world on overnight. It's going to happen in chunks. These are the chunks. So I thought it should have been better communicated, but I don't quarrel with the substance. And I think people that say, I want a date, it's like, fine, right? I want Kate Beckinsale to be coming and living here with me, but that isn't going to happen. You can't get a date. Okay?
So
you can't.
You
it's just not medically available.
Yes, because other provinces are actually having dates, so you can have a date. And Quebec's going to release their plan.
They're making them up.
You can't say that. You have no idea.
Sure.
All these
What if cases spike in the next 3 weeks?
Okay,
those dates are going to be fuck all.
Can I finish? All these provinces are taking advice from their public health officials. They are not these are big decisions, as you say, that politicians are making, and there is zero doubt in my mind that Francois Legault didn't stay up at night after listening to public health officials to make the announcement, whether you support it or not, yesterday. He was very thoughtful. He said, I am worried about kids' school year. I'm also worried about their mental health of going 6 months without being in the classroom. I'm also worried about kids that actually don't have a good home life and how it is affecting them more adversely than people in good homes. He also limited 30% of schools in rural areas that COVID hasn't been affected. In terms of Ontario, 80% of the deaths and 80% of the cases are in long-term care facilities. 95% of the people that have died are 65 and over. 4% are between the ages of 40 and 59. So this continues to be, at least for the Ontario government and for the Quebec government, a long-term care problem, which they should be focusing on more. And at the very least, the Ontario government needs to open up certain sectors right away that made no sense to shut down in the first place. The construction sector, garden centers, so people can start planting gardens and at least be outside, and also curbside delivery. I have a family friend who owns a craft and knitting store in Halliburton, and she lives above the store, and she advertises on Facebook, and it's a niche market, and she would take online orders, process them online, go down to her store, which was closed, package them up, and she had made a deal with the convenience store, which was obviously open beside her, to leave the packages there, and then people could come and pick them up. A cop saw her doing that and completely shut her down. That's nonsensical. So there are certain things the government should do to not make life so miserable. It's like Ontario is a prison and Doug is the warden right now.
See, this is what I mean by I think we're going to move into the consensus is going to fray around the reopening, because I couldn't disagree more, and I think that kind of rhetoric is a little nutty. I mean, look, I hope that Legault's program works. I really do, and I agree with you that there are careful decisions that have been made. They're careful decisions that cause me anxiety. I'm a parent. I got 2 kids under the age of 10 at home and a 17-year-old. And I am like, it's impossible, to the point you're making earlier, it's impossible to manage homeschooling and work. Those pressures are a blender of agony. So I'm worried about all the things that you mentioned that Legault is worried about kids staying home and all that stuff. And my kids have a pretty comfortable environment. So, all that. But I'm telling you right now, if I lived in Quebec and one of those schools, and I was in a district where they were opening up on May 1st, I would not permit my kid to go. And I don't think I'm being a health nut by saying that, but I just wouldn't, because although the children, the likelihood of their infection is low, although the likelihood of them getting ill if they are infected is low, right? They still will become carriers, and this thing will start to bicycle. And I would just like to see, as awful as it is to be stuck in this world, I'd like to see a greater drop in cases. I'd like to see all those risks diminish. When you say it's just a long-term care and old person thing, that may be true, or that may be a consequence of the measures we've taken. And when we relax those measures, we'll discover the opposite. I guess we're going to find, because we're going to run different laboratories in different parts of the country. But like, I'm not going to let my kids be mice.
So what are you looking for, Scott, in order for you to be more comfortable with opening things up?
I'm looking for the same thing that Doug actually identified in the thing. I'm looking for a substantial diminution in the number of cases. I'm looking for...
So we're calling him Doug now, are we?
He's a pal. I mean, let's face it. He's, he's cousin Doug, really. No, and I haven't converted to, voting for him or anything like that. But on this point, I think that being the doorway into this discussion is still the right doorway, which is we have to see some kind of precipitous fall in those tests. But ultimately, like, as miserable as it is, I don't think the world is going to relax until we get a vaccine. I just don't. There's no indication that immunity is acquired from having it and then living through it. So you might get reinfected. And we may find all these reopening things. I mean, I hope this isn't the case, but like, this whole thing could backfire. And it hasn't even hit the developing world yet, which it's going to do. And it's going to rip through that like a dose of salts. We're going to see millions and millions of deaths. Like, I wish we were out of this thing. I don't think we're anywhere near out of it.
Right. Merkel said the other day that it is definitely going to be around for years, that we're not close to the end of this thing, and we shouldn't be thinking that we're close to the end of it. But it is. I think people are getting impatient, and so it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult to maintain it over time. And to get back to the conversation with Bryant, the more impatient people get, the more they'll be prepared to give up in order to get out of the house, in order to see their grandma or see their mom or see their kids or work. The thing about working, holy Lifton, I saw Frank Graves flipped me over some data of his before this podcast, because he had some interesting stuff on civil rights and stuff. But just a crosstab he had was super revealing about how many people who make more than $150,000 are able to work from home, and how many people who make less than $60,000 are able to work from home.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
Most people in this country are not working from home. They're just home.
Yeah. And look, I know, because we get into debates and discuss this stuff, I sound like I'm wildly divergent from your view, Jenni. I'm not, actually, right? I feel all the same. I'm anxious. I don't like this lifestyle. And I'm really freaked out about my diminished productivity, worried about whether my business is going to make it. Like, it's fine-ish right now. What happens in June, July, if we're still in this world? So I got all of those same anxieties. I'm worried about my kids and all that stuff. I'm pissed off that my birthday is coming in a few days, and I'm probably not going to see my eldest son. Or if I am, I'm going to see him in a way different way than I'm going to see the rest of the family. So all those things wear on me, not as much as folks who are in less fortunate circumstances. But
are you upset about the amount of weight you're putting on?
Yes, I am. Although, look, let me put it this way. I'm containing my weight gain by not changing my pants. I'm wearing the same clothes that I had on, the same pants anyway, that I put on the morning of March 12th. And I find that as long as I stay in, the hard pants, I can only get so fat. But anyway, all I'm saying is a
couple of weeks of denial. And looking at myself from different angles, I've had to yield and say I'm unquestionably fatter now than I was when this started.
They're calling it the COVID-20 or the COVID-19.
I hadn't heard that. That's funny. To a mundane matter, though, that I kind of alluded to when we started this part of the conversation, are these daily briefings kind of running their course? What would you suggest for leaders now in terms of how they comport themselves and reporting back to the public?
I personally think I'm not saying cut it back to only if you have something to announce. I think people do want to hear from their leaders, but I don't think it has to be daily. I think that I think it can be cut back to maybe goes to 3 days a week and then goes to 2 days a week, or it ramps up if there's something that happens. It's not like the politicians aren't working; they're all working. So say we're cutting the daily briefings to 3 days a week. Continue the health brief, continue the briefings with the health officials. I'm not saying cut those out. Do the daily count, but for the politicians, I think it's maybe cut down to 3 days a week unless they have something to announce. And other premiers have done that. Premiers like Blaine Higgs, I think he goes out every few days. And when he goes out, there's like a substantial announcement.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, we talked about this a week or two ago, which is how long does this kind of campaign rhythm of daily newsers, message of the day, announcement of the day, followed up by technical details of it, and we slide into other. How long does that last? And I feel like we're getting toward the end of that particular version of it. Like, I think we're going to move to a world of when there's an announcement, we'll make an announcement. And then there'll be kind of attending that. There'll be kind of regularized updates. But the daily news are from the cottage at Rideau Hall. I'm not sure it's got a long life ahead of it. I think we may be in the last week at the most two of it. And, we've also seen our good friend, Donald Trump has withdrawn himself so far for the last couple of days from the daily briefing, saying, because, you can get tired too, these political leaders. You start you start making mistakes. You start suggesting that people should drink Javex for breakfast and, shine a flashlight up their ass or lick a stack of batteries, something like that. And so you say, you know what, maybe I need to pause too. Maybe I'm also human. Although in his case, I don't think it's true. No evidence he's a human. Did you see that clip of him yesterday? I love everybody. Was that guy not stoned? Was he not high as a kite? Come on.
I didn't see the clip.
Go find it. He is slurring his words. I love everybody. It's like, hey, dude, okay, sorry, we got to get you into a cab and get you home, okay? They're not going to let you stay in the club.
So I want to talk to you about something that being very passionate about, which is this situation in long-term care homes that Jenni alluded to. I mean, the situation outside of long-term care homes is serious, and 50 people or something died of SARS, and that was very, very serious. And this is much more serious than that. So I'm not saying that the problem has only been in long-term care homes, but the situation in long-term care homes is horrific. And the death totals do not even begin to tell the story. If you start to read about what the conditions are like in some of those homes, if you start to understand the way people died in those homes or what their last moments were like, it's really, really fucking bad. Now, I know that we're supposed to be cutting our political leaders a lot of slack because nobody's ever encountered anything like this before, and nobody had any real way of knowing what it was going to be like. But as it turns out, As it turns out, this virus is most deadly in areas where people are concentrated in close quarters. It turns out that of the people who get this virus, because they're concentrated in close quarters, old people are more likely to die of it than young people are. People in a long-term care home more likely to die of it than people at the Cargill facility are to die of getting sick of this thing. How was that not an entirely reasonable hypothesis from which to begin your planning for how to manage COVID-19? Like, how is it possible that the long-term care homes got overlooked, which it appears they literally got overlooked?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think it's a travesty as to what's happened in the long-term care homes. I feel so bad for the residents. I feel so bad for their families, and I think it's something that there doesn't seem to have been the focus among the public or the media on this issue, because it seems that there could have been protocols and things put in place 2.5 months ago when COVID started to become more of a, it wasn't just January and early part of February where it was kind of happening in Wuhan. As it started to make its way to Spain and Italy, there were indications that it was the vast majority of deaths were seniors. And I think that for whatever reason, I think some governments did not plan or did not factor that in their plan. There was a lot of scrambling to make sure hospitals got ventilators and hospitals got PPE and all the resources went to hospitals, and long-term care facilities were seemingly overlooked. And you have hospitals now who are, at mostly 50% capacity and have PPE and nurses and doctors that aren't as busy. And then you have, long-term care facilities with massive outbreaks. I think they're up to 170 some in Ontario, and that just means an outbreak is what they consider is seven or more residents. So there could be homes that actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but that's not considered in the outbreak numbers that are running low on PPE. So I think that it was overlooked. I do think this is a government and will probably end up being a political problem. My guess is when the dust settles on this, you're going to see some kind of inquiry or commission in governments where this is an issue. That's just my guess. But I just
want to. Are you a hard ass like? Go ahead, Jenny.
No, go ahead.
Scott, are you a hard ass like Jenny and I? Is this long-term care situation a human tragedy or a political scandal?
Well, probably both. So a couple things I would say. One, let's give props where they deserve. The very first discussion I think we ever had on this podcast to COVID, like when we were in its earliest days, and people were not reacting. We were doing it as an example. We were doing it together, right? In close proximity. So it was in that early March, end of February. I'm not even sure when it was.
Coughing and hacking on each other, as I recall. That's
right, exactly. Making jokes about it. Ha ha, it's so funny, eh? Ha ha. Oh, look at this funny Undertaker in the corner. And but Jenny flagged long-term care facilities right then. And she said, well, if I was in government right now, the first thing I'd be saying to the premier is we got to take a look at that, because that is the garden where this horrible fruit is going to grow.
Close them, Jenny said. Close them.
And by close them, I meant just close them from people going in, kind of.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So props on that, because it hadn't occurred to me independently. I think, I think the reason this happens, this kind of thing happens for government, is that when a crisis hits, people think of it as just like one axis where you go, okay, so the crisis is hit, where's the need? Let's respond. And some governments respond faster or slower, but it's an X and Y axis. So they say, how bad is the crisis? They respond fast or slow, but then they also do the cross-reference, the other axis, which is, and what do we own in this crisis? So governments go to, what are the things that are ours? Well, we have the healthcare system, so we'll move and mobilize on that. We have this, we have that. And I think it highlights one of the structural problems that is going to get fixed, and probably in some ugly ways, and probably in some rough and tumble ways after this crisis. And that is that structurally, the long-term care thing, it clearly didn't belong to the feds. It was regulated by the province, but the province didn't consider it part of their direct machinery, right? It's run by, there's some of it is heavily, there's some public resources, but some of it is privately done. And you could tell, I think the reason they responded slowly is they're kind of like, well, it's not like, we got to fix the things that are ours first. They didn't have someone like Jenni saying, this is where the most likely problem is to arise, and therefore it's the place that requires the most urgent attention, independent of whether we directly run those joints or not, because that's where the problem is. So I think that explains it. My view is that we're going to see the Waterloo of this sector. We're going to see it will be subjected to an inquiry. We're going to have scrutiny over things that smart people will say, we told you before this happened was happening. Like Charlene Stewart, you've had on here from the SEIU, was saying our workers are not being treated properly. The conditions in these homes are not proper. We're going to see all of that examined. And I think it's going to be for the long-term care private sector industry, it's going to be these next 4 years are going to be like what happened to the accounting industry after the meltdown of Enron, when it blew that industry up. And it got subjected to a whole other layer of regulation and control, and particularly in the U.S. And I just think you're going to see that kind of change.
I agree, and I think we're talking. Sorry, Dad. We're talking about the provincial governments because they administer healthcare, they administer the long-term care homes. But I actually do think the feds. There's going to be there's questions right now that the feds aren't getting, probably for the same reason the provinces aren't getting. The Public Health Agency of Canada was created after SARS to make sure that we were ready for a pandemic. That was ultimately their job. If we have another SARS, we have to be ready. So the fact that we are a country so short of PPE, like literally days. It seems like we're days away from running out across the country, and governments are scrambling and paying inflated prices for N95 masks. I think that's something the federal government and the Public Health Agency have to answer for, and they're not being asked about it. But I think eventually those are questions they have to answer, because that was their sole reason for being created.
I will personally always remember the efforts that the private owners of long-term care homes took to specially protect their residents through this period, which is nothing, zero. They put no additional resources in, no additional protections in. Government's going to take a lot of heat over this, but ultimately the privatization model is a failed model for taking care of our parents, for sure. Pure politics. We have been talking in recent weeks about the challenge for the Conservative Party that Andrew Scheer continues to be their interim leader. And obviously they made him the interim leader when the expectation was that that would be for a pretty tight duration and maybe not over a very consequential period of time. And it turns out that it's over a much longer duration and in a very consequential period of time. And it seems to me that more out of sorrow than anger, there's a developing consensus among the commentariat, at least, that the Conservatives should probably find a way to ease Mr. Scheer out of there sooner rather than later and replace him with a different interim leader. Scott, how do you feel about that?
Well, we talked about this a little while ago. I think that the guy finds a mud puddle to step in almost every day. I just don't know what the mechanism is. Like, is the caucus going to rise up and say, at first it starts with caucus, I think. The caucus has to say, we're dissatisfied, you got to go. And they have to pressure him. And the powers that be. But he's had the powers that be on his ass, right? You know, the Canada Fund, the Harpers of the world, they've all expressed open disdain, public disdain, and he hasn't been dislodged. So I think it will take, you have to go back to the traditional tactics that are employed. You'll have to have 3/4 of caucus sign an open letter that says, here, Mr. Scheer, we're delivering this to you on a Tuesday morning. It will go out Tuesday afternoon unless you take the fuck off train all the way to the final station. And I don't know if that will happen. Jenni will know better if that happened. And in terms of who would replace him, I think just about anybody would be better.
Yeah, I agree with you. Anyone would be better. I was speaking, I speak to caucus members all the time. I was speaking to a few of them who have been complaining about, the conversation started with complaining about the coverage or lack of coverage that we're getting in terms of holding Justin Trudeau accountable. And I said, the problem is Andrew Scheer's the leader of the opposition, and you guys can't change this. Like, you can push out high profile MPs, but at the end of the day, there's only so much bandwidth, and Andrew is the leader of the opposition, and he has no credibility for the reasons that we said, I think 2 weeks ago or what have you. So then I had a couple caucus members go, well, you know what you should do? You should call you should write an op-ed. You should really put the push on. And I'm like, you want to know something? You guys can go fuck yourselves, because
I love that.
I did heavy lifting.
Grab a gun, Jenny. We'll be right behind you. Yeah, sure you will.
And I said, I publicly stated, one of the first people to publicly state, I didn't think Andrew should stay on as leader. I truly believe that. It wasn't for any other reason that I thought it was going to be bad for the party, which it continues to be. And I said, it was you guys that decided to keep him as interim leader, even though there always could be, like, no one would have suspected something like this would happen, but there's always could be some form of crisis, or there could be, anything that bad could happen. Also, you look at the experiment with Mulcair staying on, and it bankrupted the NDP essentially. And so I said, you guys were the ones that decided to keep him on. You guys are the only ones that have any mechanism to get rid of him. But I don't see that. I don't see that happening.
So you think he will be in there till they choose a new leader? Well,
it's looking the only way he wouldn't be is if caucus, to Scott's point, wrote a letter or put a push on, and there doesn't seem to be in anyone that I've spoken to, there doesn't seem to be any appetite to do that. So
they don't feel it's doing any damage then?
No, they do, but they no one wants to be the first person to say, "Sir, you have no clothes on."
Yeah, no, it sticks around with you for a long time. All through the 2000s, I had leadership aspirants in the Liberal Party coming to me quietly over lunch and saying, I think we should get rid of Dion. I think we should get rid of Ignatieff. I think we should get rid of Ray. How do we do that? You're the guy. So one leader.
You wrote the book on fucking people,
and that's my reputation. I'm the guy that takes down liberal leaders. There's an old joke about that. It involves oral sex, but I'll leave it alone. Anyway, you don't want to be the first to take. You don't want to be the first to take out a gun, but it really is caucus's responsibility, I think, to get that done, because it's a pretty formative time. I think people are making opinions about the Conservative Party right now, and they're making it based on far from its best foot forward, I would say. In the context of that, how hard would it be, Jenny, for Scheer just to stood up and said, Derek Sloan has to fuck right off? That's bullshit.
Well, it speaks to, what was the last incident where this was? I think it was Richard DeCarey's comments when he was a candidate in the leadership race on gays. Andrew basically said nothing for 5 days and then came out and condemned it. So it's the continuance of these just, poor decisions, which is unfortunate.
Okay. Hey, let's dip into the mailbag for another couple of questions. It was a lot of fun last week, and we didn't get to nearly all the questions that people submitted to us. So let's start with a substantive one, and one I suspect that we disagree on. A listener named Glenn Kauth, I think I'm saying his name correctly, wrote us a very long and erudite and thoughtful message about the fact that our fiscal capacity and our desire for government spending is way out of whack, and that governments have for 25 years now at the federal and provincial level been cutting taxes. Mike Harris had the dramatic cut. The Chrétien, Martin, Harper governments took federal taxes down a big way. So the tax hit on the citizen is significantly less than it was 20 years ago. But he's saying, okay, now we've got all this talk about how we need to treat all these workers more fairly. We need to pay more for people. We need to have a stronger and more robust social safety net. The net of Glenn's question is it time to increase taxes in Canada? Do we have a revenue problem that we need to address in government?
No, we've had
either one of you.
We've had a spending problem, and I do not think they need to raise taxes. But I think that they absolutely are going to, because there's going to be no choice. The fact of the matter is the economy. The Liberals, who promised to balance the books federally in 4 years, were sitting prior to this with a $20 billion deficit, which was egregious to begin with. By the end of all the COVID spending, you're going to be looking at a $300 to $400 billion deficit. So add that, we have a $600 billion debt right now. So if you add the deficit to it, we could be looking at the end of this year, at the end of COVID spending, $1 trillion debt. Add to the fact that 10 billion people now have applied for CERB. That is 50% of Canada's workforce. And even if, let's say, 1 million of them are non-eligible or shouldn't apply, it's still a huge number. And my guess, out of the remaining 10 million people that haven't, the majority of them are somehow government employees at some certain level. So I think governments are going to have to raise taxes because they're going to have no choice. But I think they are going to do it on the backs of on the backs of people. Half of the country's population, because what are they going to do if our economy doesn't open and you've got 10 billion people that are on some form of assistance? It is like, I can't even imagine what this is going to end up doing for us long term. We are going to have a absolute debt problem, because the CERB, even though they're saying it's 3 months, the legislation actually is extended. It's extended to October. Like, they can keep these payments going until October, which will raise then what the projected deficit is going to be even more.
Well, I guess a couple things. I'll surprise you maybe by saying, like, my headline is I don't think there will be immediate tax hikes, because I don't think that an economy that's going to be as fragile as ours is for some time, and by for some time I mean maybe 3 years. I think it's going to be a long road recovery, is going to be able to tolerate tax hikes, and so I don't think they'll happen. In the near term, not because I don't think the governments need to raise additional funds, and not because I think that it's unreasonable for government to raise additional funds. But I don't think it will be the right economic policy when we're trying to encourage economic growth in that kind of circumstance. I do think it's important to remember, when we get in this fiscal conversation and people start becoming, deficit and debt hawks, like, it is all relative, right? And by that, I mean this, and I'm not trying to be glib about it, just the opposite. If you're in a room full of ugly people and you're ugly, well, then you're not ugly, And if you're in a world where everyone has been forced into a heavily public sector debt situation.
So you're not really my friend, Scott. You just hang around me because of that?
David, you give me cover. As long as I stand next to this guy, I got a shot. But I mean, seriously, and so what we're going to find, and what I think the great public policy challenge is going to be, isn't that, like we did in the 1990s, where Canada's debt to GDP ratio had galloped into an unsustainable place in relation to not only absolute. It wasn't not just in absolute terms, but in relation to all other major developed economies. All major developed economies are going to be in this same boat. And so we're going to have to think about that on a macro level. It's why I keep harping about the need to have the G20 to sort of say, okay, so how are we going to coordinate monetary policy, what the role of central banks are, what sort of complementary government policies are going to be required, because we're all going to be in this boat. And because we're all in this boat, we're all ugly, and therefore none of us are ugly. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have to address it over time, but this happened in the Second World War. Every major economy was heavily indebted. Its debt to GDP ratio ballooned, and then governments managed it. And so I think it's not beyond the ken of mortals. I don't think the immediate and obvious remedy will be tax hikes, because tax hikes will retard growth. They'll retard the recovery. And I think we'll find that arrow will be taken out of our quiver, maybe on the wealthiest of the wealthy, that kind of thing. But we all know that those policies only actually recoup only so much funds. So complicated answer, but I think the really interesting question is what are governments going to do working together across developed economies to say, how do we commonly meet the equal challenge of the twin challenge of having our economies recover and bringing down our debt collectively?
Glenn, you hit on a very, very fundamental and important issue. Governments do have a revenue problem and not a spending problem. The Ontario government, which is renowned for its public indebtedness, is the lowest per capita spending government in Canada. It's not spending too much money, it's taking in too little money. And as we are all now talking about the need to strengthen governments, we have to look at the fact that, as you say, for 25 years, governments have been starving themselves. They have been cutting taxes and weakening the capacity of the state to respond to events. And we've seen some of the implications of that now. So yes, I think we are going to have to contemplate tax increases. And I think we should start immediately by talking about the fact that the reduction of top marginal rates from what they were in the 60s and 70s to what they are now has greatly exacerbated inequality in this country. And second of all, as Elizabeth Warren has pointed out, the real money is now not actually in income, it's sitting in wealth, and wealth that is accumulating. And I was a big fan of Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax to deal with, to help address inequality and help those that are profiting so staggeringly from our economy put more back into funding government services for other people. So Glenn, I'm with you. We got to raise taxes. But in doing so, we got to realize that that most people are falling behind, or many people are falling behind, not getting ahead, and really shouldn't be the burden bearers of that. Okay, our second question. Zahavi, I hope I'm saying this correctly. Zahavi Zinaberg?
Yeah.
Zinaberg says, "Hi, David. I have a question for the panel. Who do you think Biden will pick as his running mate, and will it make a difference? Thanks in advance," he says, Jenni. Who will they pick? Who will Biden pick, and will it make a difference?
I don't know. Listen, he'd probably be smart to pick Kamala Harris. She could actually be president. She'd help him with the African American vote during the election, where he's already strong. Strong himself. So she's an option. He's obviously said he's picking a woman as a running mate. So there are a few options that are floating about. And I think she would probably be the most credible person on the ticket for him.
Yeah, that Stacey Abrams is campaigning hard for that gig, though, from Georgia. Scott, who do you think?
Well, I think you have to apply this test, and it's obvious. But he's 116 years old, and we all know that in his case, people are thinking to themselves, "Hey, who could take over the job?" And so it was a different choice for FDR in 1944 than it was in 1936, right? And I think in this case, Biden recognizes that people are going to be looking at that person and saying, could they become president tomorrow? Do they have what it takes? Now, in comparison to Trump, you say to yourself, well, that glass-colored ashtray I have could be a better president. But I think that's going to hurt Stacey Abrams ultimately. I think that the narrowness of her resume, no matter how attractive a candidate she is probably going to hurt her a little bit. And I think it advantages somebody like Kamala Harris. You don't need Kamala Harris to win California. Obviously, that's a walk. But I think I lean in this case toward that because it's the question that's on everyone's mind, right? What if you keel? Come on, Joe. What if you keel?
So yeah, that will be a big test that you have to pass, and a sturdier one, a tougher test than that test normally is. So I agree, the VP pick has to pass that. I'm not an expert, but my observation of American politics has been that efforts to pick a VP candidate who speaks to an ideology or speaks to a broad constituency have generally failed. I saw no evidence that Geraldine Ferraro helped the Mondale ticket. I don't think ultimately that Sarah, Jesus, I've forgotten her name,
Palin.
Palin helped McCain very much at the end of the day in 2008. And I've always thought the test of a vice presidential candidate was a pretty limited one.
LBJ helped Kennedy.
That's the point. Does a VP candidate help you win a state you would otherwise have lost? So LBJ delivered Texas to the Kennedy ticket. So who delivers? To me, the question would be, pick your swing state that you need to win if you're Biden, and who most increases your chances of winning that swing state. And that takes me away from both Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris, much as I love Kamala Harris.
So who do you think?
I understand that Michigan is starting to look tough for Trump. So if I was them, I would pick somebody from Michigan. I don't know who it would be, but somebody from Michigan to seal that off.
The governor.
Yeah.
She's a Dem and Trump hates her. He appears to trigger her.
Right. All right. Well, that is our listener mailbag for today. That is our podcast for today. Scott, you've got a bright looking clean shirt on there. You look better than you've looked for the past couple of podcasts. I'm happy to see that you're sprucing yourself up. Jenni, the pandemic is very becoming of you. You've never looked better.
You're sweet.
COVID couture.
To all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. To our sponsor, TELUS, thank you very, very much. To the Air Quotes Media team and our sound production engineer, Metal Donkers Good, thank you very, very much. And anybody, if you got a little bit of time on your hands, either fight your way through the iTunes system to give us a review and a rating on iTunes, or say something about this pod on social media, good, bad, or indifferent. Helps get the word out, helps generate interest, and helps give us a reason to keep coming back every week. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you in a week with the panel and another very big, interesting guest. Till then, take care.